Apparently, word had gotten around about the Yosa's guest. As Penelope and Samir made their way back to the nebula, they found a crowd had formed. Whispers cut from person to person as they jostled for a view. A young private happened to turn around to see Penelope.
I doubt we're going to see Moot.
He stopped. His eyes first showed confusion at Penn's more civilian dress before quickly widening in recognition.
Sk.
He snapped to attention and saluted.
An honor, Scylla. Ma'am, Captain.
Please, God, just pick one. Ma'am is fine.
At this point, more soldiers turned and the cascade of attention rippled through the crowd. Jostling for a view of the ship switched to jostling for a view of the bay entrance. The energy teetered on that of a mob, but never fell over the edge. Some threw questions, others simply stared, but everyone came to a sudden halt when Samir's voice boomed over the bay intercom.
Marines!
Immediate silence. Samir brought his own voice down now that there was no competition.
You will all clear a path for Penelope, or I will have the lot of you praying to every god that you were back in basic. I already know that at least half of you have shit to be doing, but I will overlook the momentary lapse in judgment. Now, move.
Before he'd even finished the sentence, a wide corridor had been formed leading to the lowered bay door of the nebula. Not a soldier spoke, but as Penelope began to walk, the crowd did something. First one, then 2, 5, 10, and more until finally each attendant was saluting. Crisp and at attention, each one held their stance, index finger against the edge of the eyebrow and palm out. It made her uncomfortable. To be honest, she almost hated it, but she knew they meant well by it. As she walked, she tried not to linger, tried to not make direct eye contact with anyone for too long. One face held her attention, though. A young woman, couldn't have been active service for more than a couple of years, held her salute over a scarred face. Pockmarks spattered randomly from her chin to her hairline near the left ear. Unlucky, or perhaps very lucky, with a grenade most likely. Pen didn't stop, didn't even slow, but she met the girl's gaze and held it as she passed. The girl had brown eyes, Pen noted as the moment passed, and immediately wondered why the detail had stuck with her. Pen made it to the on-ramp and turned towards her friend. Samir had stopped short, but held out his right hand. Pen took it and pulled him into a burly hug.
About Cerberus.
He started, but she stopped him with a hand.
No need, I was wrong to put it on you.
Still, I know it meant a lot to you. Stay safe, all right?
You too, Sam.
And I know it may be difficult, but stay in touch, yeah?
Pen smiled and nodded. Samir stepped back and Pen backed up into the nebula's cargo bay. As she looked back over the gathered crowd, she saw the members of Fire Team Excalibur gathered in the doorway she'd come through. They joined in the salute. She thought back to her little deal with higher-ups. It was well fulfilled, and she owed them nothing, but it tugged at her. Just as well, she knew everyone here meant well by the gesture. The pause was awkwardly long, but after only a few seconds, she raised her own hand in a less-than-perfect salute before turning, the ramp rising behind her. Quickly, the crowd dispersed, whispering here and there as the blue nebula lifted off the bay floor and floated out into space. Pen wanted to collapse on her bed more than anything, but forced herself to stop near Deg and Gareth. They stood next to a small, reinforced container. Gareth seemed dubious of it, not that he could move it if he wanted to.
Pen, it seems they loaded a little something onto the ship. SM said they brought it on just after unloading the other stuff.
We're not being asked to run weapons, are we?
Gareth asked.
No NIA thinks they can just nonchalantly slip a hammer into my hands and think I'll start finding nails.
Both non-humans took a few seconds to work through the turn of phrase. They were getting better.
And are you going to put the tool to work?
Deg asked.
No. NIA can solve its own problems. As for this...
She opened the container to reveal a light version of the traditional shock drop armor and a hawk.
I can take it to my room, tuck it away. Suppose it is better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
I suppose. Though my people have a saying about finding what you search for.
Gareth offered. Pen didn't disagree, and was that a more respectful tone? Pen waved the thought away. More likely she just wasn't that good at interpreting the Vylon version of vocals. It was an odd series of clicks, nothing like human speech, but she thought she'd gotten the hang of it.
I'll take it to my room, but to be honest, I'm exhausted right now, so do you mind if it stays here for a minute?
She asked the captain.
It's not in any danger of exploding imminently, so no, not at all. Think I could go for a bit of rest as well. Gareth, you can handle our first jump, no?
Of course, it'll be the first time we're coming from Terran space, but I think I'll manage. Can get some work done on our inventory afterward as well.
He looked around the cargo bay. Pen made a mental note to ask them what they were talking about, but right now it was time for some much-needed sleep. Not that she was much looking forward to what came with it. With a two-finger salute, she excused herself, made her way to her room, and collapsed in a heap. Deg followed suit soon after, leaving Gareth to chart the nebula's route to the Formal. It was being held on a Corval pillar planet this time. Not a capital per se, but a hub of politics and trade. Gareth noted the quickest route took them through 2 Terran systems before making it out of their territory. Tunnet took over the bridge while he made his way back to the cargo bay and did a complete review of the nebula's inventory. It was tedious but important, and if he was being honest, he liked tedium. It was comfortable and gave him time to think. Right now, he needed a lot of that. His mind was still processing what he'd seen. It was almost too absurd to believe, but he also couldn't deny it. He'd seen it with his own eyes. Out of all of it, and this surprised him, his mind kept returning to the final piece of the video. The image of Pen, doubled over on the cold floor of a ship, picked at him incessantly. He thought it would have been the part where she dismantled a killing machine with nothing but a hand axe, but he found that part not all that remarkable. Not that it wasn't impressive. It was, but maybe that's what it was. When he imagined Pen, he imagined her doing something like that. On the other hand, he found it difficult to imagine her in such a vulnerable position. She always seemed so cold and ready, but maybe that was more of a facade than he'd first thought. No one mentioned it, but a few crew members noticed Gareth's slower than normal pace. Pen's night was unpleasant, to say the least. It wasn't one of the worst ones when they'd say things, but it was vivid. Over and over again she watched the armored sentinel charge forward. Steel footfalls slow in that way dreams slow down but are inevitable and unstoppable. Mac's body crunched and compressed as the machine forced him into the concrete wall. Mac's screaming and finally silence before an eruption of thermite. Then it'd start over. Finally, Pen managed to force herself back to consciousness. It was a Herculean task, like swimming to the surface of a pool with weights attached to each arm and leg, but she managed it. 4 hours of sleep. Better than nothing, she supposed, and even though she was still tired, she knew she wouldn't be able to roll over. She never could. So she set herself to bringing NIA's not-so-subtle gift to her room. It was something to do, at the very least. As she entered the cargo bay, she saw Gareth sitting by the bay's main terminal. He looked back and forth between the terminal and a personal data pad. At this point, he was the only other person in the cargo bay. She froze about halfway to the container. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and a chill ran down her spine. She'd learned to listen to that little voice in the back of her head, always speaking up when her subconscious noticed something that she didn't. Her eyes darted about, her ears listened carefully. Hell, she even noted the temperature, the taste and smell of the air through her breather. Nothing. No. The lights. It was the lights. She'd walked into the cargo bay through that specific door 100 times now, and she knew what lights should be flashing and where.
You all right, Pete?
A crack, then a rush of pressure, and finally the hot roaring of an explosion ripped into the cargo bay. Seconds too late, Penn had realized there was a small device attached to the cargo bay door. It was wedged just near the hinge where the door met the floor of the cargo bay itself. She didn't have much time to process the recognition as atmosphere violently filled the bay. Penn had to grab onto a nearby support beam to keep herself steady. Gareth was far less lucky and found himself flung away from the terminal and thrown to the floor. Pressure equalized and wind force took over. Seconds later, Penn watched as Gareth was taken once again. With nothing to hold on to, and little chance of fighting the forces flinging him about, he was sucked out the mangled hanging bay door into open sky. A few things occurred to Penn in quick succession. An orange sky, not void, was splayed out beyond the back of the ship. In addition, an atmosphere of some kind filled the bay. By luck, it seemed that the nebula was close to a planet at the very least. Tonette's voice came over the intercom, but the ripping wind made comprehension near impossible. In any case, she didn't have time to wait and focus on what they were saying. She acted. Letting go of the pillar and surging forward, Penn grabbed the armor container as she passed. Her feet never stopped, and she was quickly gaining more momentum than she'd be able to counteract. As she neared the newly created exit to the ship, she threw the container forward and without letting go, allowed it to take her into the open sky. The last thing she noted was Tonette's face coming on the main terminal, their odd beak-like mouth moving rapidly. As Tonette's face was replaced by an open sky and a rapidly receding ship, Penn righted herself and immediately started scanning for Gareth. Her hands moved simultaneously, set to a task of their own. She opened the container and started to pull pieces of the hawk out and attach them. First her wrists, then waist, and finally ankles. It was by no means an easy task, but this very situation was one any paratrooper was trained for, and by the time she had each piece locked into place, she'd found her companion. Quite opposite to Penn, who had instantly oriented herself in her descent, Gareth was flailing and spinning. He was quite clearly screaming as well, but no sound was making more than a few centimeters from his mouth. Penn closed the container and let go of it, nudging it in the same direction the ship was headed. She pressed her arms to her side and angled her descent towards Gareth. Without any kind of covering for her eyes, the wind stung as it whipped by, but she kept her trajectory and quickly closed the distance between them. Still in free fall and spinning wildly, it took Gareth a moment to notice the familiarly large creature hurtling towards the ground next to them. If the situation weren't what it was, Penn would have laughed at the visible emotional roller coaster Gareth experienced in a matter of seconds. Terror, confusion, recognition, and then back to terror. The first thing she did was carefully grapple him to stop his spinning. This also muted his flailing. He tried to yell at her but could barely hear his own voice. Penn confirmed her inability to hear him by tapping her hand to her ear and shaking her head. With the stability, Gareth managed the presence of mind to reach his hand up and interact with his translator. Penn heard a slight high-pitched click in her ear, followed by a series of other clicks, and finally, a translated voice came through.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, listen. You need to wrap your arms around my neck and your legs around my own. We're falling slower than normal, but cutting speed is going to be rough. You need to hold on with everything you've got, even if it hurts. You hear me?
What if?
They continued to hurtle.
No what ifs. This is what's happening. No matter what, you stay with me.
Gareth followed her instructions, even grabbing onto her sides with his ancillary arms. Incredibly, she returned to the aerodynamic pose and shot towards the ground. His hearts raced, and his instinct was to pull away, flail, and protest. Nevertheless, he pushed it all down and clung as tightly as he could. Not that it was very hard, as his instincts were also screaming at him to secure himself to the nearest solid object, which in this case was Penelope. Amid the terror, Gareth gave a moment to lament the fact that these kinds of things did not happen before she came aboard. The atmosphere rushed past, an all-consuming roaring and whipping. The way he was positioned pushed him into Penn, but he held tight anyway, bracing for the dreaded moment that things changed. It took too long. He didn't know what a roller coaster was, but he now knew what that pit-like feeling of continually building anticipation was. After a short time, Pen spread her arms and legs, catching as much air as possible and slowing their descent. Soon after, she totally reoriented herself and took the same position she had when she dropped onto Raxia. She'd be using all the fuel to make the landing as easy as possible. The G-forces wouldn't be nearly enough to affect her, but she wasn't too sure about her companion. Even a slow descent might force him to black out. That wasn't her only worry either. She'd trained for Allied equipment failure. She was following the same protocol, as if a friend's gear had unexpectedly failed, and she was their lifeline. But all of that assumed another human's ability to hold on to her, which was no easy feat, and Gareth was no human. No point in worrying now, she supposed. She shot a prayer to anything that was listening and hit the jets. Gareth was praying as well, begging the light of his home star to shine on him, and perhaps it was, as even though the force of slowing from the initial activation jerked him upward, he kept his arms locked around Pen's neck and managed to hold on. After that initial burst, things got easier for a time. Forces equalized, and Gareth found some small hope that he might not find himself a very unsightly smear on the rocks of some random planet in the middle of nowhere. In fact, he had so much hope that he tried to open his eyes to look around. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a very bad idea. He'd managed to stay conscious through the increased G-force, but as he looked down, he saw a steep jutting of rock all but blitzing straight at him. With a shock of terror too much for his system, he blacked out and started to go limp around Penelope.
Fuck.
Pen yelled to everyone and no one. Instinctually, her left hand shot around to secure Gareth before he could slip away. She managed to stay her strength just enough to keep him in place but not shatter his midsection. Catching him, however, completely threw the careful balance of thrusters slowing their descent. With the left one gone, her right hand had no counterbalance and immediately threw her into the side of the rock formation. Again, on instinct, she turned her back to it to keep Gareth from grinding against the incline. Simultaneously, she reoriented her right hand to rebalance. Rock and gravel ran across her back painfully, but she pushed it away and kept her focus on a safe descent. They'd already slowed considerably. She was honestly proud of Gareth for holding on as well as he did, for as long as he had. Just a few more seconds. It wouldn't be pretty with a missing thruster, but she'd make do. Just as she thought that, however, her foot caught on a small, jutting stone, and she was sent head over heels. Again, her back slammed into the steep rock formation, and the air was forced from her lungs. She kept the presence of mind to cut the jets, bring her other arm around Gareth, and adjust so that she was rolling side over side. Thankfully, they'd slowed enough that, though incredibly unpleasant, she wasn't going to die from the impact. The rock formation turned from a sharp incline to a shallow angle, and Pen let herself roll along the dirt and gravel till she came to a final, merciful stop at the bottom of the rock formation. For a moment, she didn't move. Gareth lay unmoving on her chest, though, and quickly she grew concerned. She'd made her arms a brace as they rolled so that either her forearms or back were the things taking the most punishment. She gently brought a hand to his face.
Gareth?
She sat up and cradled him in her arms.
Come on, you stuck-up son of a... I did not jump out the back of the fucking nebula just for you to fuck off anyway.
I suppose that would be rather rude of me.
He answered weakly.
Hey everyone, hope you loved the video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for more awesome sci-fi content. You can also support us by hitting the thanks button or becoming a channel member. Your generosity helps us bring you more stellar stories. Every bit counts. Thanks a bunch.